When Akhenaton became pharaoh of Egypt around the year 1360 BC, he kindled a religious revolution. He wanted to restrict worship to the sun god Aton. Egypt had been a polytheistic realm for more than 2,000 years. It was an immense risk here, of all places, to attempt to found a religion with a single god.
Akhenaton was not only a founder of a religion, he was the first founder of any religion who is known to history.
The visions of the ruler on the Nile opened up a new chapter in human history. The Great Temple at Thebes, the stronghold of Akhenaton's opponents. This is where the pharaoh initiated the struggle for his new religion. He sent a momentous message to the high priest of Amon. The king ordered the construction of a new sanctuary, honoring the hitherto insignificant god Aton. It was the largest place of worship ever planned in Egypt. Sacrifices to the new god were to be made on more than 400 altars. The old temple, until then the most splendid building in Egypt, seemed modest in comparison. It was a scandal that the king had even considered this plan. The temple of Karnak was a mighty fortress. Generations of pharaohs had made it their ambitious task to constantly increase the size and splendor of the chambers of worship. The treasury and storehouses of the holy precinct were just as full and rich as those of the pharaoh. The place was frequented by the country's elite. Hundreds of priests served in rites in this sprawling complex. The temple's schools educated the future leaders of what was then the most powerful realm in the world. Karnak was a powerful state within the state. And its high priest was a dangerous rival to the royal court. He was responsible for ensuring that the gods were well disposed towards people. His contemporaries firmly believed that the country was doomed if the cult was interrupted. Even though the priests were in theory only charged with maintaining order in the temple, they also had worldly power. They called themselves servants of God, but primarily they served themselves. Sacrifices of incense, food, and drink were offered to the gods daily in order to buy their goodwill. Whole armies of priests and officials performed their duties at the temple in a strict hierarchy. In addition to the services, the buildings were in constant need of repair and beautification. However, to Akhenaton, the inner sanctum of the temple seemed like a dungeon. Here, true faith could not blossom. His decision was irrevocable. Amon's time was over. Long live Aton, god of the sun. The White Chapel in Karnak dates from the time when Amon became the main god of Egypt. It was Pharaoh Sesostris I who had it built. Its images and hieroglyphs contain an allegedly everlasting truth. Over and over again, they show the king communing with the god. The inscriptions conjure up their magic unity. Amon and the family of the gods recognized the pharaoh when he sacrificed to them. It was a mutual agreement that appears to have been vindicated time and time again. No pharaoh could avoid the traditional rites, until the arrival of Akhenaton. The rules of the realm of the pharaohs said, the king should rule in the palace, the priest should rule at the temple. However, the more the high priest's influence grew, the more and more difficult it became for him to adhere to this rule. Already his predecessors had forced their will on the pharaoh several times, and no one had until then dared to rebel against the priests of the highest god.
In fact, the first step taken by Akhenaten was to raise the economic status of the newly founded temple of Aton above all other temples, and to make these other temples pay a kind of tribute. The second step was to close the other temples anyway. But it is still very significant that the first measures were carried out on an economic level, and theological steps were only taken later.
The priests of Amon displayed their power in numerous processions, but the change in their fortunes had already been prepared by Akhenaten's father. Amenhotep III had himself depicted next to other gods more and more frequently, an insult to the divine overlord Amon. However, the pharaoh hit the high priest hardest in his own domain. Like Amon, Amenhotep had himself carried to the new temple at Luxor in a ceremonial sedan chair, a humiliation for the servants of the god. All the same, Amenhotep did not want to abandon traditional ideas of faith entirely. First, he turned himself into a god by building the Temple of Luxor. His brilliant master builder Amenhotep designed a grandiose sanctuary in which the gods and the king were worshipped alike. It was a stroke of genius that gave the architect fame and honor beyond his death, and the pharaoh was held in awe by his subjects. When Amenhotep died, the priests who had once been all-powerful had already been stripped of a large portion of their rule. With his son's ascension to the throne, a new chapter in Egyptian history began. Still, he was named, like his father, Amenhotep, one beloved of Amon. But Amon was not going to enjoy the reign of this young king.
Is Akhenaten the forefather of all the great monotheistic world religions? In any case, he stands at the beginning. He stands at the beginning of a line that is then continued in the persons of Moses, Zarathustra, Jesus, and Mohammed.
The pharaoh was as if obsessed by a religious fervor. Any means seemed justified to him to enforce worship of his single god. For this, he even changed his name. Amenhotep IV became Akhenaten, the Exalted of Aton. This was the name under which he wanted the world to worship him from then on. Even the novel bas-reliefs on the walls of temples and tombs were a provocation for conservative priests. Akhenaten's shocking watchword was truth. In a realm where beauty and balance were valued above everything else, the ruling couple was suddenly depicted as misshaped, fat and ugly, with paunches and wide hips. And above it all, there was an incomprehensible god.
This is the traditional way of showing the Egyptian sun god, always with a human body, a falcon's head, and the sun disk, and always seen from the side. The problem resulting from this is that only one person can face the god at any given time. Traditionally, it was the Egyptian pharaoh. During the Amarna period, the situation was special, in that the king and queen were supposed to benefit equally from the presence of the sun god. Akhenaten's revolutionary contribution now is to dispense with the body of the sun god completely, and to turn the sun disk around to the front, so that king and queen can benefit equally from the sun god's signs of life.
Until then, only the pharaoh and the priests had been permitted to celebrate the service to the gods. However, by order of Akhenaten, a woman was now allowed to do so too, Nefertiti, an unforgivable violation of a taboo. As far as the priest was concerned, the pharaoh had declared war on the gods, thereby severely endangering the continued existence of Egypt. The high priest had to refuse to obey. However, Akhenaten preempted him. He had the temple stormed and the sanctuaries defiled. He prohibited a tradition several thousand years old and persecuted its adherents mercilessly. His henchmen had only one aim: the annihilation of all vestiges of the old religion. They destroyed its inscriptions even in the least accessible places. No one dared stop these royally supported iconoclasts until all the temples of Amun were reduced to rubble. The stable world order was in upheaval. A revolution was shaking the pharaonic empire. Traditional law and order were being stripped of their power. The priests of Amun strove desperately to save at least a few idols of their god. Overnight, Amun had become the archenemy. Hard times were dawning for the realm on the Nile. Aton was supposed to shine, and this was why the pharaoh decided to leave Thebes. In the city of Amun, a new beginning seemed impossible. Far from the sites of the old gods, Akhenaten searched for a place fit for the worship of a new god. He found it downstream, at the center of his empire, in a place that is today called Amarna. Having shaken off the shackles of the past, the ruling couple wanted to make their dream come true. This is where it was to rise, the holy city of the god Aton, a colossal backdrop for the cult of the sun god. A god who assumed his rule over the sky every day, visible for all. The location of the new capital was desolate and uninhabited, but it was ideal for Akhenaten's plans. Where the temple of Aton was to be built, no other god had ever been worshipped, virgin territory in the religious sense. Far and wide, the pharaoh had these words hewn into the rock: "View Akhenaten, which Aton ordained to be created for him as his everlasting monument." The high priest of Amun suffered an unparalleled humiliation. He was condemned to work for the monuments of his archenemy in the quarry. But Akhenaten could not rob him of the faith in his god. In a very short time, a city was built, the like of which there had never been before in Egypt. It was a giant center of worship laid out on the drawing board. Akhenaten himself supervised the surveyor's work and proudly announced that he wanted to stay in this place until the mountains rise up and go on their way and water runs upstream. This is how the city may once have looked. This reconstruction is based on data from decades of excavations. The pharaoh had consecrated the largest building to his god. Blinding sunlight filled the temple. Several hundred sacrificial altars stood under the open sky. Akhenaten's idea was that nothing should obstruct the sun god. He fills the land with his rays and gives life to everything. He who daily intoxicates my eyes by his sight, when he rises in the temple of Aton, at Aketaten.
This reconstruction of a part of the temple's wall is 3 meters long. The scene symbolizes the sunrise of Aton in the morning, and it shows how its rays brings the animals to life.
In
Akhenaton's natural philosophy, this means that the only god Aton is responsible for all aspects of life, and this life begins in the morning with the sunrise.
Just like the sun god crossed the sky daily in the Egyptians' imagination, Akhenaten also drove throughout his realm in his golden chariot as a vital messenger of peace. Images in the tombs of Aketaten show how much the king identified with the god. The heavenly chariot was almost everywhere. As if seized by the ecstasy of speed, Akhenaten's drive became a headlong soar. No one seemed to be able to slow him down anymore. For his subjects, he was a visible god who performed miracles and influenced the fate of each person, one who held life and death in his grasp. The king himself composed a hymn in which he described his god's omnipresent influence.
This great sun chant of Akhenaten's begins in Egyptian with the words, "You appear beautiful on the horizon of the sky, you, living sun who rules life.
You have risen on the horizon of the east and have filled every country with your beauty. Beautiful you are, radiant high above all lands. Your rays encompass all lands to the limits of everything that you have created. When you set on the western horizon, then the world is in blackness, in a state of death."
There is a direct trace of Akhenaten's great sun hymn via Canaan in the Bible in the 104th Psalm. Verses 20 to 30 of the 104th Psalm are a shortened Hebrew translation of Akhenaten's great sun chant.
Whereas the God of the Bible despised any and all worship of humans, such worship was at the center of Akhenaten's religion. Only he was able to interpret the will of Aton. There was no route to the god other than through him. The people had to pay homage to him if their prayers were to be heard. However, many did not want to give up their time-tested faith. Even in the new capital, some still prayed to the old gods. It gave solace in everyday worries to address the gods directly with pleas and prayers. People made their sacrifices despite the constant danger of discovery. The proof of this is a find from the ruins of Amarna.
This vase of the god Bes shouldn't exist in Amarna. The only god permitted by Akhenaten was Aton, the sun god. However, next to him, and below him, behind drawn curtains as it were, the population of Amarna continued to worship a number of the old traditional gods. There really wasn't any other possible development. If there's a decree from above that all the faith that's grown over 1,500 years is suddenly supposed to be no longer valid, there's no way there are not going to be problems.
In their songs of praise, the people sang, "You are the image of the living Aton." But what did Akhenaten's subjects really think? The pharaoh may not have wasted a single thought on this worry. He had himself worshipped like a distant, exalted image of the god. He claimed the right of resurrection from the dead only for himself, taking away all hope of being born again from the rest of humanity. The pharaohs built pyramids and temples even in the days of the old realm, in order to be closer to the gods once the pharaoh was dead. They hid their burial chambers and sarcophagi deep inside these immense buildings. The walls were adorned with countless hieroglyphs, magical chants and texts from the Book of the Dead, in which the burial rituals were described, and how the dead king was transformed into Osiris, the ruler of the underworld, in order to rise from the dead, like him, to eternal life. Open the tomb, break the wall, and the gates of heaven are opened for you," promised the writing on the wall. The dead man had to account for his life before the tribunal of the dead. The god Anubis weighed his heart. It was not allowed to be weighed down with any sins, otherwise a monster devoured it, equivalent to eternal death. At the entrance to the chamber of the sarcophagus, a priest performed the ritual of the opening of the mouth, a symbolic act of revival by means of touching the dead body. Akhenaten had all this prohibited without exception. In the desolate plain of Tel al-Amarna, there is no perceptible trace of the 50,000 people who once lived here. The Sun City vanished thousands of years ago. Even Akhenaten's name was purged from the annals.
The whole city of Amarna should be destroyed after Akhenaton, because every Egyptian worshipped Aton through him. And this is why you can even, the hands of the sun are coming to Akhenaton. And therefore, it is only Akhenaton who had the connection between Aton and the people. Then when Akhenaton died, the connection is finished. And this is why Amarna had no use.
After Akhenaten's death, the priests of Aton were those who had to flee. Iconoclasts once again ravaged the temples and palaces. Now it was Akhenaten's name that was chiseled off everywhere. His god vanished into insignificance. Amon became king of the gods once again. Under his patronage, a new ruler named Harem-Heb had the memory of the heretic deleted from history. In Karnak, Harem-Heb erected mighty buildings for Amon and used every stone of the dismantled temple of Aton as filling material for the new buildings. Today, reconstructing the walls of the temple of Aton presents archaeologists with a barely possible task. No image of the heretic king was supposed to remain for posterity. Even his capital, Akhenaton, was abandoned. Akhenaten's vision of a single god seemed to have failed. After his death, he reaped the violence that he himself had sown during his lifetime.
Even if
Akhenaten's name was deleted from the lists of the kings and his monuments disappeared from the face of the earth, it still has to be said that his religious revolution changed the Egyptian world profoundly. On the surface, religion reverted to tradition, but the idea of the unity of God never left Egyptian thought again from then on, so that behind the multitude of gods, who were now once again worshipped, Egyptians recognized more and more clearly the one God who revealed himself in this multitude.
In Abu Simbel, Ramesses II had a gigantic temple complex built, propaganda made of stone. These buildings for himself and his spouse Nefertari were driven deep into the Nubian rock. Colossal statues more than 20 meters high glorify the pharaoh as Amun's representative. Amun in the shape of the sun god, far away, unreachable in the sky, but at the same time close, coming to the assistance of the praying man. In this way, the former god of war appeared in a new dress, as the god of the poor and downtrodden, without displacing the other gods. Already the population nearly worshipped him more than the rulers and priests. He was a popular god, not an abstract vision of the elite. When, every morning at sunrise, the miracle of his divine appearance occurred in Abu Simbel, the ritual concerned all Egyptians. Every spring and autumn solstice, the light rays reached as far as the cultic images in the inner sanctum, in order to symbolize the resurrection of a pharaoh who had died. Even for normal mortals, there was once again hope of a life after death. Atun's strict ruling seemed to be forgotten completely. However, the idea of monotheism lived on in secrecy until it began its unstoppable success, rising again many centuries later. Akhenaten's vision of a single god was going to conquer the whole world. A new chapter of Egyptian history began with the rule of the pharaoh Akhenaton. His visions would plunge the realm into an unpredictable crisis. The young king forced a revolutionary new faith on the people. They had to believe that only a single god could bring salvation, Aton, the burning sun. The ruler was Atun's only mouthpiece on earth. It was the law. By Akhenaton's side ruled Queen Nefertiti. Had the pharaoh succumbed to her magical beauty? Even 3,000 years later, the final verdict has not been passed. Did the king lead his realm to disaster fully conscious, or was he only a puppet in the hands of a ruthless woman? Mentally disturbed and bodily disfigured is how his opponents characterize him even today. Was it a love-crazed dreamer or a despot obsessed with power who ascended the throne of the pharaohs around 1360 BC? Akhenaton took possession of the palace of his parents. The magnificent building provided the right surroundings for the young ruler's high-minded plans. His father, Amenhotep III, had ruled the realm for almost 4 decades, but in the end, Akhenaton's mother, Tia, had exercised the power. With an ingenious maneuver, he made her his ally. The proof is a small bust in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin.
Investigating this with the aid of computer tomography has enabled us to find out the extent of the change that a great historical personality like Tia suffered in the instant of her husband's death.
Our computer tomography proves that Akhenaton literally idolized his mother. Under the queen's heavy wig, the headdress of a goddess appears. The son elevated his mother into the divine pantheon during her lifetime, and thus ensured her loyalty forever. In spite of this, Tia was no longer the most important woman at the royal court. This position by Akhenaton's side was to be taken by a complete unknown, the mysterious Nefertiti. Even her name is a riddle. It means the beautiful one has arrived. A hint as to her origins? Was she born as a princess in a faraway kingdom? Or was she from the Egyptian royal family, even a close relative of Akhenaton's? Had she even lived in the harem of Amenhotep III, and was only married to Akhenaton after Amenhotep's death? The rumors about the stunning beauty on the pharaonic throne never seemed to cease. The official reports from the Amarna period present the royal couple as an ideal match. Bas-reliefs show the two in tender embraces. What was it that linked them so inseparably? A perfect relationship without any dark sides? Together, they had their new capital built in the middle of the desert, a huge endeavor. Tens of thousands moved to Akhenaton. The walls were erected quickly. For the foundations, millions of building stones had to be procured from all over the country. In the quarries, workers are forced to labor under the most harsh conditions. Akhenaten and Nefertiti governed the fates of people in the City of the Sun in a high-handed manner. They had realized their dreams and believed that they were looking into a glorious future. Aided by the records kept of excavations, British archaeologists have reconstructed Akhenaton with precision. A generously planned garden city can be recognized in the computer animation. He wanted to stay in this place until the river would flow upstream, the pharaoh announced. The throne room in the royal palace could hardly have been excelled in splendor. From here, Akhenaten and Nefertiti wanted to carry their faith in the one God all over the world. Does this look like the center of power of a madman?
In my view, Akhenaten was not mad. He was far ahead of his time. He thought differently. He may well have seemed dismissive of his contemporaries, of course, but Akhenaten was certainly not mad.
Just as the sun god in the Egyptians' imagination traversed the sky every day, thus Akhenaten hurried restlessly throughout his realm in his golden chariot. Depictions in the tombs of the highest officials of Aketaten demonstrate how closely equal the king felt to Aton. His portrayals in divine poses adorn the walls everywhere. His subjects were meant to no longer be able to distinguish between God and king. Akhenaten wanted to be the only visible God who performed signs and miracles and interfered in the fate of the individual, one who held life and death in his hands. The royal family's excursions became processions of divinities. There is not a single scene on the walls of the tombs in which the royal couple is not the center of attention. As if seized by the ecstasy of speed, the king and queen's drive accelerated to a headlong movement. No one seemed to be able to slow it down anymore. Akhenaten and Nefertiti even banished the gods of the underworld. A life beyond the grave. In Amarna, it no longer existed. The only thing that counted here was the veneration of the rulers and the worship of the omnipresent sun god. On the other hand, the royal couple proved generous towards the living. Those who served it faithfully were richly rewarded. Golden rewards for merit were bestowed by full hands. Was the people's loyalty merely bought, or did the people serve the new god in deep faith? The royal court rejoiced in its newly won wealth. Life was a generous present from Aton and had to be enjoyed. Music and dance were the order of every day. However, it was a class of upstarts who determined the atmosphere at court. Pedigree was no longer a decisive factor. Only obedience towards the royal couple counted. The prospect of rapid social progress lured more and more people into the City of the Sun. If we believe the way Akhenaten's reign is represented on the temple walls, his subjects did not lack anything. But do the drawings represent the facts truly? Egyptologists view them as pure propaganda.
The pictures of a friendly nature in the descriptions of sacrifices must not obscure the political reality for us. The king was really only interested in enforcing his personal power, and even religion was subordinated to this goal. The king declared himself the son of the sun god. The sun god conferred power to the king, and the people had to obey.
How stable was Akhenaten's realm? How long can an empire last if the state is built on oppression? Akhenaten had bestowed universal power on himself. The people abased themselves in proskynesis, which means making obeisance in the dust. But did the people really always obey blindly? Why did the bas-reliefs and painting in Amarna show so many soldiers and law enforcement officials? Did the king have to fear envy and betrayal from all sides, as befits a despot? Researchers think that Akhenaten's reign was a period of intolerance and consider his regime to have been a police and surveillance state. Mahu, the chief of security, was an important personality in the capital. Intimidation and strict control of the population certainly had some tradition in ancient Egypt. Or was this totalitarianism imported from abroad? Was Akhenaten merely a tool and helpless against the whisperings of his spouse? The ancient Orient was ruled by brutal men of power. Murder and manslaughter were the order of the day, even in the royal houses. Had Nefertiti imported these cruel customs from her homeland? Today, we know that many princesses from the Near East lived in the harems of the pharaohs. Political marriages were arranged to keep the warlike peoples in the north peaceful. In those days, between the Babylonians and the Hittites, there lay the realm of the Mitanni. Is this where Nefertiti was born? Mitanni was forgotten. However, all of a sudden, the accidental discovery made by a farmer's wife in 1887 was to change this. In the ruins of Amarna, she found clay tablets with strange characters on them. Had this unsuspecting woman hit upon a treasure, or was it merely worthless rubbish? Her neighbor saw a good deal and bought the tablets off her for a handful of coins. However, neither art dealers nor scholars were interested in the find. Cuneiform writing in Egypt, it had to be a clumsy fake. No one understood the value of the clay tablets. It was almost the complete correspondence of the pharaoh with the mighty of the world. Would hints finally be found here as to the pharaoh's true character? If we believe the reports by foreign ambassadors, we see again a picture of a crazed visionary. In one letter from Babylon, the complaint was made that the pharaoh kept emissaries waiting for so long in the blazing sun that they dropped down dead from exhaustion. This is also a reason for suspecting Akhenaton of neglecting foreign policy completely. However, there is not a single indication of a possible foreign origin of Nefertiti. The rulers seemed flawless and faultless to those surrounding them. Or was there a tragic secret hidden behind the facade? Most pictures represent the royal couple as plump and shapeless. One statue shows Akhenaten as heavy as a pregnant woman, neither holy man nor holy woman.
If you look at his face, and even Semerkara and King Tut, all these people, you can see the whole family. There is something was not really correct in the deformatives. There are deformatives in the belly and the shoulders and the face. And this is why I believe that maybe this was the order of justice to be shown in art. Because if they wanted a very realistic, beautiful face in the afterlife, they should be shown different.
Colossal statues show Akhenaten naked, but without even the slightest hint of sexual organs. Or was this supposed to look like a woman? Perhaps Nefertiti? Traces of red paint, the ancient Egyptian symbol of masculinity, prove that this is the king. But why then this ambiguous representation? Did Akhenaten suffer from a disease that disfigured him? It is conspicuous that his daughters' heads have unusual shapes too. Aided by modern technology, we explore this phenomenon in depth. Neuroradiology Department of the Charité Hospital, Berlin. A team of doctors carries out a revealing investigation. X-rays probe a skull that displays the same abnormal shape as in the Amarna clan. The doctor's diagnosis is that it is a so-called boat skull, a genetically caused deformity. The three-dimensional view permits a journey into the inside of the disfigured skull. The seams in the skull have not expanded since the person was a baby. The growth of the brain increased the pressure on the skull from inside. Did this affliction drive Akhenaten mad? His daughters were victims of the same defect, an indication of inbreeding within the royal house, perhaps. This suspicion takes us to the laboratory for nuclear medicine in the high security wing. Aided by radioactive substances, geneticists here do research into changes in the human genome. Their particular interest is in the genes of siblings. Could their investigations also reveal something about Akhenaten's affliction? The results of the test are astonishing. Each red mark indicates a dangerous correspondence in the genes. It is most likely that Akhenaten's daughters too could hardly have avoided an hereditary defect. The royal family now appears in a new light. Was Nefertiti more than just Akhenaten's wife? Was she even closely related by blood? Analysis of the family tree of the Amarna dynasty can perhaps give us important hints. Frequent intermarriage between siblings alarm a geneticist. An unusually high number of stillbirths and deformities of descendants is typical for such relationships. This effect is increased if, over several generations, very close relatives in a family conceive children together over and over again.
Es erscheint wahrscheinlich, dass die zwei
It seems probable that these two stillbirths are connected with the relation of their parents by blood on the one hand, and on the other hand, of the maternal grandparents as well.
Großeltern mütterlicherseits.
These are portraits on a sarcophagus of Akhenaten's grandparents, Chuyu and Juya. Egyptologists, however, have found evidence that they may have been Nefertiti's ancestors as well. In this case, her mother-in-law, Tia, would at the same time have been her aunt, and Akhenaten would have been her cousin. There were potentially dangerous genetic similarities everywhere. The inbreeding endemic in the ruling family was justified by the way their claim to power was established. Only the pharaoh's children were considered to be heirs to divine legitimacy. This privilege had to be confirmed over and over again by marriage between the physical heirs, between prince and princess. The gilded throne of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. This son of Akhenaten died at the age of just 20, a mysterious death. He was obviously too young to call such splendid treasures his own, so how did they come into his possession? Had this throne been crafted for a far more powerful ruler? At any rate, it hardly afforded Tut much protection. Even though the child who was Pharaoh and his sister spouse left Akhenaten's sun city and returned to worship of the old gods, they're depicted under the protective rays of Aton. However, no celestial being blessed them with healthy children. In the famous tomb, archaeologists found only 2 fetuses that were incapable of survival, an indication of a marriage between siblings. Tutankhamun was the only pharaoh whose rich treasures remained almost undamaged for millennia. His name was forgotten, and the shaft leading to his tomb was obstructed by later buildings, a lucky coincidence for archaeologists. Also, the legendary mask of Tutankhamun's mummy hides a secret even today. The latest investigations confirm a long-held suspicion. A new mask with Tut's features was soldered onto an existing masterpiece made of pure gold. The only probable explanation is that this was originally Akhenaton's death mask. In the western valley of Thebes lies the tomb of Pharaoh Ai. He had married Tutankhamun's widow and ascended the throne himself. In his tomb, not a single trace is left of the heretic belief in the sun. The old gods had again assumed their habitual place in the rites of death. The Amarna period seems to have vanished like an apparition. Thebes had been reinstated into its traditional rites as the burial palace of the pharaohs, and by order of Ai, the priesthood of Karnak was celebrating again the traditional rites. Nonetheless, the iconoclasts went to work in his tomb. Large gaps are seen in the decorations on the walls. Why was this pharaoh hated so much too? Was it because Ai was Queen Tia's brother and Nefertiti's father, as some researchers believe? The northern palace in Amarna. Is it possible that the queen spent the last years of her life here, separated from Akhenaten? Had he cast her out? This seems unthinkable, for Nefertiti was irreplaceable in his conception of faith. She embodied fertility as the realm's supreme mother. One thing is certain. In the 13th year of Akhenaten's rule, the queen disappeared from public life. From this time onwards, her name was never used officially again. Did she fall into disgrace? Was she murdered? Or did she die peacefully? This wooden portrait head of young Tutankhamun has put scientists on the trail of a family drama. The shape of his face is exactly identical to that of this mysterious woman. Kia was Akhenaten's favorite wife and is now considered to be Tutankhamun's mother. It is still disputed whether Kia shared the pharaoh's bed during Nefertiti's lifetime. However, the queen is under suspicion of having enforced her claim to power with murder, for the concubine Kia disappeared from the annals of the court just as suddenly as she had once appeared, and without a trace.
Akhenaten rule is really very strange, because when he died, there was a kind of a help that has been done for Semenkhkara, his son, to be the king. And therefore, I believe that Nefertiti had a role in this. She killed Semenkhkara and appointed Tutankhamun to be the king. And therefore, here we come, the role and the influence of Horemheb as the overseer of the army, and I, to make a conspiracy, in my opinion, and they killed King Tut.
Was Tutankhamun really murdered as suggested by a large hole in his skull? The Amarna period was characterized by an astonishingly high mortality rate. This would be explicable by an epidemic, as evidenced by cuneiform texts. There are more and more indications that Nefertiti survived her husband. On clay tablets, the mysterious Dakhamutsu letter has been preserved. In it, the widowed spouse of a king without an heir of her own asks the king of the Hittites to send his son to her for the purpose of marriage. The riddle of the sender's identity now seems to have been solved.
For more than 80 years, it has been disputed who the mysterious letter writer was, whether it was Akhenaten's widow, Nefertiti, or Tutankhamun's widow, Akhenaton. For me, this is as clear today as 25 years ago. For the king of Hittites writes approximately the following: the Egyptians and Hittites have been friends of old. And now this is happening too, namely the planned wedding. However, he writes, you should not have attacked our vassal several weeks ago when your king died. Thereupon I grew furious and sent my troops, and they attacked your province of Amkar. From other sources, the so-called Amarna letters, we know that precisely this attack on the province of Amkar took place in the year Akhenaton died. And before that, there had been no military conflicts between the Egyptians and the Hittites. The conclusion from this is that the writer of the letter can only be Akhenaton's widow, Nefertiti.
The wedding did not take place, for the Hittite prince was murdered on the way. Had Nefertiti finally lost the struggle for power? Akhenaton and his queen are now counted among the great personalities from the land of the pyramids. Scientists search tirelessly for hints as to the possible hiding place of the royal mummies. Fortune hunters hope for a miraculous coincidence and the discovery of rich treasures in the tomb. For it will only be when the vanished mummies are found that the last riddles surrounding Akhenaten and Nefertiti can be solved. It was like a dream of paradise on earth. A loving couple governed Egypt and provided their people with peace and happiness. Nefertiti was the most beautiful woman in the realm, and Akhenaten the greatest visionary of his time. They had a grandiose new capital built, dedicated to their only god Aton. Yet the dream perished in disaster. Monuments of the royal couple were recklessly destroyed. Priests declared Akhenaten a heretic. Even the royal tomb was desecrated. But what happened to the mummies? Did they too fall victim to the priests' hatred? The first rumors about a forgotten pharaoh reached Europe in the middle of the 19th century. The first evidence was found by the scholar Richard Lepsius. He began documenting the treasures of Egypt's ancient art in 1842. In tomb complexes and temples, his staff copied wall paintings and took casts of bas-reliefs. From Cairo, his journeys took him south. He kept an exhaustive diary about the work of the Royal Prussian expedition at the stops on their journey, following the Nile further and further upstream. In Middle Egypt, near the town of Asyut, Lepsius made an astonishing discovery. On both banks of the Nile, he found traces of a pharaoh whose name was missing from the established list of kings. His curiosity was aroused. Feverishly, he followed what hints the locals could give him. In his diary, one can read about monumental bas-reliefs and tomb complexes decorated in a highly unusual style. The mysterious pharaoh is said to be their builder. A border stela hewn into the rock told of a huge city whose ruins were nowhere to be seen, yet the city existed, hidden under the sand of millennia. High above the small desert settlement of Tel El Amarna, holes are discernible in the rock face. Lepsius found unfinished tombs. Even the memorial statue of a deceased court official remains faceless. Nonetheless, the complex offered fascinating new insights for the German scientist. The walls are adorned with highly unusual images. A god named Aton rides a heavenly chariot, or is it the mysterious deified pharaoh who is holding the reins? Chancellor Ramosi. His tomb, built several years previously in Thebes, was still furnished entirely in the traditional style. Hundreds of gifts were given to the deceased on his last journey. Ample food and beautiful flowers. The dead man was lacking in nothing. Even dying seems to lose its terror in these surroundings. The stay in the hereafter was made to be as comfortable as that in this life. This was vouched for by the pharaoh and by the priests along with him. In a last sacral act, the ritual of the opening of the mouth, the corpse was finally reborn. Of this, the Egyptians had no doubt. The priest, wearing a mask of Anubis, touched the mouth so that the dead man could once again eat, drink, and speak. The richly decorated tomb bears witness to the prosperity of that time. It was a world full of pleasures and luxury. Tribute filled the royal coffers. Egypt had never experienced such wealth before. At the beginning of the 20th century, another German expedition arrived at Amarna. The area was systematically excavated and every find was archived. The excavation of a sculptor's workshop yielded especially rich rewards. Many of the statues are preserved unusually well. The archaeologists found new hope. Their finds until that point had been mostly fragments. The city had obviously been destroyed deliberately. An archaeological sensation occurred on the 6th of December 1912. Excited, the workers alerted the man in charge of the dig, Ludwig Borchardt. When he carefully uncovered the find, it took his breath away. In the diary of the dig, he noted laconically, describing it as useless, "Look at it." There had never been anything comparable before. It's not surprising that the people of Akhenaton worship Nefertiti like a goddess. Does this also explain why nothing is known about her origins? Is the reason why her parents were never named because a goddess could not be a descendant of man? The storehouse of the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. This is where a part of the finds from Amarna is kept. Professor Dietrich Wildung is looking for evidence of Nefertiti's fate. Thousands of broken fragments prove that a whole epoch was violently annihilated. Among the fragments, Nefertiti's sensuous mouth. The important question is, when and why was her statue destroyed? Suddenly her name ceased to appear in Akhenaton. Had she fallen out of favor and been cast out, as supposed by many scientists?
The only evidence of a burial for Nefertiti is provided by these two fragments of the tomb statuette of a queen, this one which is at the Brooklyn Museum in New York, and this one from the Louvre in Paris. And this can be shown, even though they don't fit together directly, by having a middle part like this molded. This shows that both fragments may belong together. And the inscription reads, "The noble woman, the great one of the palace, the praised one of Akhenaton's, the great royal spouse Nefertiti, may she live forever." And this proves that Nefertiti was buried. Moreover, she was buried with honor, with her full titles, and not as an outcast as was supposed for a long time.
This burial with honor can only have occurred in a single place, the royal tomb of Amarna. It had always been a desolate canyon. By order of Akhenaten, his whole family was to be buried here. Many walls are hewn only roughly, and a large part of the customary decoration is missing. The tomb complex was obviously never finished. However, in a side chamber, there are traces of a large bas-relief. The inscriptions and pictures bear witness to the deep grief felt by Akhenaten and Nefertiti when they buried their second-born daughter. Her early death must have been a shock. Even Aton could not shield the royal family from suffering. And even after death, Akhenaten's family did not find peace. Even the images on the walls of the burial chamber were brutally chiseled off, down to the sun disk of Aton. In the middle of the room, an empty pedestal of stone. No trace of Akhenaten's or Nefertiti's sarcophagi, and no trace of the royal couple's mummies. Were helpers faithful to the king able to spirit the corpses to safety? One trail leads to the famous Valley of the Kings on the western bank of the Nile near Thebes. Almost all pharaohs of the New Realm had their last resting places built here. Splendid paintings adorn the walls of the tombs even today. However, there are hardly any royal mummies left in the stone sarcophagi. We're accompanying Dr. Nazri Iskander, a specialist who is much in demand concerning the mummies of ancient Egypt. He's on his way to the grave of Pharaoh Amenhotep II. 100 years ago, archaeologists made a puzzling discovery here. Next to the empty sarcophagus, they discovered the mummies of the most famous pharaohs. What had happened here? In 1871, the brothers Rasul were ranging throughout the western mountains of Thebes. Like almost all locals, they earned a lucrative extra wage by raiding tombs. They discovered a tomb hidden away deeply at the bottom of a crevice. No one had entered it for millennia. The dreams of these men seemed to be coming true. There were boxes with statuettes of the dead, statuettes of the gods, and amulets everywhere. A large number of grand sarcophagi appeared in the flickering light. This was when the Rasuls knew they had not entered any ordinary tomb. This discovery was something very special. There were too many sarcophagi and mummies here at once. However, they did not find any real treasure. They had been preempted by other grave robbers in antiquity. Greed for gold used to overcome any scruples or fears even then. It was not the beauty of the items of jewelry, but only the value of the precious metals that attracted the plunderers as if by magic. Scientists estimate that several hundred kilograms of such ancient works of art were simply melted down, an irretrievable loss for mankind. When, 3,000 years later, more and more extraordinary burial gifts appeared in the international trade in antiquities, the trail quickly led to Kurna. The village is situated at the entrance to the Valley of the Kings. From the beginning, the police suspected the brothers Rasul. Threats of a long prison sentence and the vigorous methods used in interrogation led to a full confession. Mohammed Rasul revealed the location of the hidden tomb. More than 30 mummies were brought to daylight by the archaeologists under police protection. Even pharaohs as legendary as Ramesses the Great. Far from their original tombs, here they had found a second resting place. Now they traveled back down the Nile to the museum in Cairo. 100 years later, French researchers want to uncover Pharaoh Ramesses' last secrets. In a purpose-built lab, the patient is examined. What 3,000 years of sleep in the desert had not been able to do was done by the air at the museum in a very short time. The corpse had been attacked by 89 highly toxic types of mold. The medical diagnosis tells us Ramesses had trouble walking. His vertebrae had fused together. He was 90 years old, 173 centimeters tall, and had reddish blonde hair dyed yellow with henna by the embalmers. Probable cause of death, blood poisoning owing to a tooth abscess. His hands seem well groomed and are wrapped in fine royal linen. However, from him who in his lifetime trampled his enemies into the dust, who had many hundreds of thousands of tons of stone piled up to show his glory, death took all outward splendor. The fate of a glorious ruler. But what fate befell the heretic Akhenaten? Mummy doctor Iskander knows that a secret is hidden in a side chamber of the tomb at Amenhotep. By opening it, the scientist hopes to shed light on a dark chapter of the time of the pharaohs. Not all royal mummies have so far been identified, and of some rulers there is no trace. Behind the wall, 3 mummies lie hidden. Dr. Iskander is looking for hints as to their identities. The bodies are badly damaged. There are traces of violence everywhere. The consequences of careless embalming? Or the work of plunderers? Who else could have had an interest in mutilating the corpses? Could these mummies even be from the time when the realm was ruled by Akhenaton, who was remembered in the history of Egypt as the heretic? Could the best preserved mummy be, in fact, Queen Tia, as supposed by the finders of this cache of mummies? However, Akhenaton's mother must have been more than 50 years old at her death. Investigations prove that the mummified woman died at no more than 35 years of age, an age that corresponds exactly to that of Nefertiti. Is it here that the mummy of the rejected queen lies? But where is Akhenaten? Elsewhere in the Valley of the Kings, in 1907, the American archaeologist Theodore Davis made a sensational discovery. In an unobtrusive tomb, he found the remains of puzzling furniture. The chamber was in complete disarray. There were fragments of a shrine bearing the name of Queen Tia, magical bricks bearing cartridges with Akhenaten's name, and a gilded sarcophagus with a royal mummy. Was this the mummy of the heretic? Carefully, priests removed the golden mask that showed the features of the pharaoh. No one was meant to identify this king. Even the cartridge with his name was destroyed. In his lab in Cairo, Dr. Iskander is comparing an X-ray of the unknown king with that of Tutankhamun. Both skulls display so many similarities that they must be those of close relatives. Father and son, Tutankhamun and Akhenaten. The mysterious dead man was only 20 years old when he died, too young to be Akhenaten. He must have been Tut's brother and predecessor on the throne of the pharaohs. Smenkhare married to one of Akhenaten's daughters. For several years, another mummy whose identity is unresolved has been kept in Dr. Iskander's laboratory. Inscriptions identify it as Amenhotep III.
And then we try to make here some similarity between these two skulls. And you see that this one is too big, and always rejected by the program in the computer about the similarity. The skull here is too big than the usual. But we don't know, maybe this was replaced, or the name which was written on the coffin, on that mummy, was not clear. We are not sure anyway of this, that this is really the Amenophis III, maybe an Amenophis IV. The way of embalming here, or mummification method or process, is completely different, because it is very weak, and the flesh is very little, and we cannot be sure that this is caused by the process itself, or suffered from moving from place to place, or being played with by the tomb robbers, or being played with by the priests of that time. Then we have a shadow here.
Might the unimaginable really be true? Did Akhenaton's mummy escape the destructive fury of his persecutors? In the rubble outside the rock tomb, archaeologists have found fragments of royal tomb furniture, parts of a sarcophagus deliberately smashed to small pieces. It seems to be conclusive proof of a burial of Akhenaton in this place. But what happened to the mummy? Who could have ordered the rescue of the heretic king? Only one single person could have done this. The only pharaoh in whose tomb almost the entire contents remained undisturbed for millennia, Tutankhamun, Akhenaton's son. "1,700 precious burial gifts were discovered by the joyous excavators in 1922 in his tomb in the Valley of the Kings. His shrine proves that Tut reverted to the worship of the old gods. The protective statuettes fulfilled their purpose. No one disturbed the dead man's rest for 3 millennia. The mummy was supposed to exist forever, for only an undamaged body guaranteed eternal life in another world to the pharaoh. For this purpose, first the entrails were removed from the body and kept in special vessels, canopic jars. Palm wine and incense were used to disinfect the abdominal cavity. Spices masked the pungent smell of the corpse. Careful conservation of a dead body could take months, depending on the dead man's wealth, but 70 days was the minimum prescribed. Strict rules had to be observed. After washing the corpse, the embalmers retrieved the innards from the abdomen through a small cut. Only the heart, as the seat of feeling, but also of thought, kept its accustomed place. The brain was removed through the nose using a hook. Then the most important process began, the desiccation. The corpse had to lie in a special salt for 70 days. This drained all liquid from the tissue and prevented it from decomposing. Finally, the corpse was wrapped in fine linen that could be up to 100 meters in length. This extensive and expensive procedure was carried out by specially trained embalmers. The secret recipes and techniques of their highly respected craft were handed down only orally from generation to generation. Pictures on old mummies tell of the secret procedure. First, the body of the dead pharaoh was washed and fragrant balms were poured on it. The uncontested lord of the holy burial rites was the jackal-headed Anubis. A picture that is 3,000 years old shows the god of embalming in the act of stirring bituminous liquid. During their excavations, archaeologists discovered a bowl with a black insulating compound, as if the embalmers were just taking a break. In the Department for Nuclear Spin Tomography of a Berlin hospital, we want to use the latest scientific methods to investigate how the ancient Egyptians used to manufacture eternity. This mummy, almost 2,000 years old and from the Egyptian Fayum region, is screened in the computer tomograph. Modern archaeology has long been using such advanced techniques. In this way, precise three-dimensional images of the mummy's interior are created. The diagnosis is clear. This is a male who died when he was very young. However, according to the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians, his life did not end there. Rather, at the point of death began an eternal, immortal existence in a divine world, for which the corpse had been made suitable through the process of embalming. The image shows a perfect technique of preservation that has kept the corpse almost undamaged for over 2,000 years. The ancient Egyptians were masters of the art of producing eternity. This was their main concern. This was why they built their pyramids and why they took such trouble in embalming their corpses. However, evil will could also achieve the opposite. A corpse merely had to be physically destroyed. The safest method of complete annihilation is to burn a mummy. Was this the fate of Akhenaten? Or is he just buried by the sands of time?